All right, welcome back to A Plateful of Insights. Good to have you back with us again. We have our third, I almost put two, third episode of this month on men's health. And we have a lovely person returning back to us to finish off this little mini series that we started on men's health this month. We have Andrea back with us to join us. So for those of you that are new, haven't listened to or watched any of our episodes yet, my name is Brandon. I'm a registered dietitian at Revive Wellness. I'm also the manager of Revive Wellness too, and I'm joined by whoever
I
wants to go
am
next.
Matthew. I am also a registered dietitian at Revive Wellness.
Yeah, and I'm Andrea, also a registered dietitian and the clinical lead at Revive Wellness.
All right. So if you haven't watched or listened to our previous two episodes on men's health, please take a look at them. You don't have to watch them in any particular order. We didn't have an order to them in which you needed to listen or watch. So if you want to just listen to this one or watch this one first and go to the other two, sweet. So what we want to cover today is we want to talk a little bit about social and emotional well-being. So the other ones talked about nutrition. We talked about nutrition and fitness. We talked about supplementation and some things specific to men that we felt were interesting to talk about, discuss. Some were that not necessarily exclusive to men, but nonetheless still important to discuss in that context. So social and emotional well-being, obviously this is a very broad topic that we can go into many different directions with. So we're gonna try and keep it a little tighter and not try and scratch too much of only the surface and go in as much depth as we can. And we have some ideas for some future episodes that we might go into a little bit later. So we'll stay tuned for those pieces. But to start us off, where do we want to kick us off? I think we were wanting to talk about stress management first. Yeah. I think that was the consensus.
Yeah.
So who wants to kick us off related to stress management? What comes to mind first?
So, something that comes to mind first with stress management is recognizing that it can have impacts on other domains of health that are not just mental health. And that includes things like nutrition. So, if something like stress management is an issue in one's life at a particular time, this can interfere with things like just being able to manage the time and the energy to prepare food and to have enough time to put effort into more full and maybe more balanced meals. Stress can also impact things like our levels of hunger. So, not just the motivation or ability to prepare food, but even just wanting to eat it. And then stress can also have an impact on just expanding on the amount of food. For some people, it can lead to eating less than they would normally want or need to eat. And for others, it can lead to eating more than they would otherwise want or need to eat. So just recognizing that stress can generally impact nutrition in a number of different ways, I think is an important place to start off.
Yeah, and even just to take on that, we think about stress can look different. It can be something a short-term spurt of stress, maybe that drives adrenaline, rush to get something done. But then we also have these longer kind of the chronic stress, the stress that we, might feel from a job or a strain or family member or relationships or whatever. And we know that that impact of that high stress over time then does start to impact nutrition, energy wise, wanting to do other areas and component of lifestyle as well. So there seems to be this kind of acute stress, but also this chronic stress that some people function very high with this high level of chronic stress as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to note this because I know a lot of times when I'm talking to people, um, when I'm working one on one, the the conversation around stress is like, well, why does that matter? We're talking about food. We're not talking about mental health or what's going on in my brain. But I always tell people, when we're talking about nutrition, we're talking behaviors, we're talking decisions, and anything that can impact those processes. Obviously, stress is a huge one, and stress is I mean, it's kind of a blanket term of sorts. Stress means different things to different people, and stress can present in different ways. I also say there's stressful situations, but there's things that may make people more prone to stress, or that make people less or more tolerant to stressful situations, which then can have domino effects. And so, if you don't appreciate those things for you, then you may miss a potentially massive part of why you aren't moving forward with whatever journey you're on that's brought you to this point. Obviously, mostly in the context of nutrition, but you can take that into anything with health, really, I think.
Yeah. It's an area that I tend, when I speak with clients, it's not something we think about first. It's like, oh, we need to get the nutrition figured out. I just need to move more and, do that. We tend to more think of those as the culprits. Meanwhile, the stress in our just emotional well-being or mental health well-being are the things that we tend not to bring to the forefront, but are likely driving a lot of that, or the root of the why things are they are, the why it's difficult to move forward, or why this is showing up like it is. And yeah, stress has the ability to kind of leach in everywhere. And Matthew, you spoke to like it can cause cravings to go up, but then we even know stress then impacts sleep, which then causes cravings to go up. So it kind of just leaches in everywhere.
Right. That's why, like you said, during assessments, we may ask about things like stress or things like sleep, because it's important that we recognize problems with nutrition, whether it is uh, being able to make the time to make foods that we know are healthy for us, or foods that we know maybe we're lacking, or even just prioritizing the time to make food and balancing everything. That's why we ask those kinds of questions, because issues with nutrition tend to not be a first level problem. There tends to be some underlying component, either mentally, socially, environment wise. That's why those things are important to discuss with dietitians.
Now, like one thing that we talked about earlier before we started recording is knowing the difference between different approaches you need to take with stress. And if it's not been something that you've dug into deep enough or deeply for yourself, uh, you may find that there's potentially conditions that or diagnoses commonly thought common ones are like anxiety, depression, even things like sleep apnea that can impact stress management, stress levels, ADHD. I mean, the list goes on. That if you just think, oh, I'm just stressed out, and I just need to get better at managing my stress, whatever that means. I've heard that so many times, um, which is well, what's that mean? But if there's actually a thing that is not necessarily 100% within control, that is clinically diagnosable, well, then you gain access to all kinds of other tools and interventions and treatments that can make that easier. That's not necessarily you having to rely on willpower in any particular situation. Um, so I guess that leads into the next point: when to seek help from a mental health professional. Because obviously, as you've already noticed, we are all dietitians here. We are not mental health professionals. So when to seek help in this area, Matthew, what comes to mind here?
Something that's important when assessing when it's time to seek professional help for really any issue, whether it seems to be something nutrition related or more of a mental health basis like anxiety issues or depression issues. Something that's important is that it doesn't need to get to the point where something is extremely obviously, or something seems to be like a diagnosable specific condition. Something that is below that level is still something that's important to address. And addressing things early can even prevent it from potentially getting to that point for in some cases. So it's important that we recognize maybe could be stress, could be a mood that is impacting our day-to-day life. And maybe it's something we're recognizing that we're not able to manage by ourselves. Still taking it seriously and not thinking that it's not bad enough or not serious enough to address, because it can be hard to assess that for yourself for a number of reasons. One is that we're not ourselves, and most people watching are not themselves mental health professionals. You're not going to like pull out a checklist that's used for a clinical assessment and like do it on yourself. It can be hard to recognize when it is truly at that point, especially if it's becoming like the norm for you, where maybe very gradually levels of stress or levels of low mood are getting worse and worse. It can be hard to recognize how bad it truly is and how seriously it is impacting you. So it's good to see a professional earlier rather than later, once it seems to be at a point that you're not able to manage it by yourself.
I think those are really good points about, getting ahead of it. And this is kind of where, there's the bias of not talking about it, or, the social norms of it. And it is really important to reach out to anybody. It doesn't even have to be a mental health worker. It could be a loved one or a support person or a friend, to say, hey, you know what, I'm just kind of feeling this, right? And kind of saying it out loud and just kind of putting it into that space, because it could just show up something like, oh, you know what, I'm really struggling with this meal plan, but I don't know why. And it's frustrating. And there's got to be a reason behind that. It could be something just like this, or it could be the words that we probably hear very common. Oh, I just don't feel motivated to do this. Or, you know what, this is just not, something kind of I want to do, or just something's not quite right, but you don't know what it is. These are great opportunities to open the conversation door. And if that leads you down, seeking mental health support, there's so many different avenues, that way. And to Brandon's point, it opens up more treatment options and doors, which, circling all the way back around, if we're feeling better and our sleep is better, then that opens the door to, you know what, I do feel like, moving my body or eating better. Like, it comes kind of roundabout circle once we open that door.
The common way I see that present is, pushing stuff under a rug, um, or thinking that it's not. Says, no, there's people that are in a worse situation than me. It's fine. I'll just deal with it. Meanwhile, you're just, quietly drowning in the corner. Uh, Even small issues that potentially having a doesn't need to be a major impact. Whatever your experience is still valid and still real, and it's still, no one can take that away. Unfortunately, there's reasons why people think this to begin with. Usually it comes from people that are saying things to these individuals that are like condescending or dismissive in such a way. I mean, you'll never get that if you're working with any of us at Revive. That's for sure. Um, but recognizing even that, if you're dismissing your own challenges for reasons that are just, not not conducive to your good health and helping you do whatever you want to do, then that's a good indication that maybe we can, maybe there's something to do here. Maybe there's something that you can explore that'll make that easier in some way.
Right. And to expand on the like other people have it worse or worse versions of the same issue, the logical like full conclusion of that is like there's one person who's able to complain about things or feel negatively about things, which is obviously not the case. There isn't like a specific threshold where this is enough to be taken seriously. And like mentioned earlier, it is better to address these things earlier before they get way out of hand, that you're now the one person who has it bad enough. We want to start with these things earlier.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. Oh, it's you just wake up one day and you're just like, oh, it's bad enough. Okay. Well, what does that mean? It's
One of the things, and also the reasons why, dietitians tend to talk about it, well, we definitely do at Revive, and why we ask about it is because it does show up in coping mechanisms in people when you're talking about their meal pattern. So it's not out of left field for us to go, we need to talk about stress, because it sometimes is just showing up as a coping mechanism of even snacking or not feeling full and just, kind of cravings and the emotional eating piece and the eating patterns or behaviors or food that's linked into behaviors or even to the point of alcohol as well. So we do see it showing up as coping mechanisms, which is why our team tends to bring it up quite a bit and ask about it because of the link between those two things.
Okay. Any things on this piece that we want to address before we move on, Matthew? Anything that we want to dig into before we move on to the next points?
No, I think that was a good transition into some of the forms of emotional coping that that Andrea will discuss that maybe we want to assess and find alternatives to.
Yeah. So coping mechanisms. I mean, there's lots of different forms of coping mechanisms for people from even gambling or um, shopping, things like that. When we're talking about from a dietitian perspective, we would see the kind of the coping potentially in when we're asking about alcohol consumption, even caffeine consumption, any other forms of eating consumption or different behaviors for sure. I was kind of wanting to loop into the alcohol guidelines first because it is a coping mechanism that is perceived as just, oh, this normal coping or coming home from work and having, a drink of something or winding down or decreasing my stress with a beverage of choice. Um, and if anybody follows the news of any kind, there was now new guidelines specifically around consumption of alcohol, which is where this is kind of coming from, which has to do with more of the risk. So the more alcohol that's consumed, the more risk there is of alcohol related consequences, cancer risks, including, colon cancer as well, which, and then, kind of risk of harm. So the guidelines came out in 2021 and they kind of are a shift of that. Now I can't even remember what the men's one was because before they were very gender specific. So it was like for men, 7 to 14 per week, right? I feel like I'm okay. That could be wrong.
Yes, the previous guidelines,
Previous
were
guidelines,
quite high.
right, for men were quite significant versus women, where now actually they have removed for men and women and put it more as a blank statement. So lowest risk meaning 0 times per week, and then the more you have, the more risk you are. So that is an area to kind of think about, and one of the things our team talks a lot about is really reflecting and taking a step back. And that's one of the strategies with alcohol itself, is taking a step back and assessing, how many times am I using this? Am I using it as a coping tool? Am I doing this in pattern with something else? Am I having a drink out of a situation that I was, feeling frustrated or angry or whatever? Because that could tell you that there's something there that probably maybe needs to be talked about or reached out for help about, or something that you maybe want to try to do some risk reduction, which means reducing slowly as well.
Yeah, and to just expand on those new guidelines. So one thing that we wanted to touch on was how, with regards to men's health, that males are more likely to engage in excessive alcohol consumption. And with these new guidelines, as Andrea said, it is now considered more of like a continuum where a higher level of alcohol consumption is associated with higher risks. But these new guidelines also emphasize that the safe level is 0 drinks per week. And then 2 drinks or less is what would be considered the where you're likely to avoid alcohol related negative health outcomes related to alcohol. 3 to 6 drinks per week is considered to be more of a moderate to high risk, where there is an increase in certain types of cancers, as well as things like accidents and other potential injuries. And then at 7 drinks or more, that's where there are things like a higher risk of heart disease, a higher risk of stroke. And then additionally, past that, we see even steeper increases in all of these risks. So those are the new guidelines with that.
And I think related to alcohol, it's important to consider, like you said, Andrea, like where this comes from, why it's happening, what's going on alongside it. I know a lot of people I work with, depending on the industry that you're working in. I mean, alcohol consumption is just a thing. You taking clients out for meals, or you going out with your coworkers or your buddies, or sporting events. I mean, the list goes on. And oftentimes, I mean, there's a social component to alcohol consumption that you feel like you belong more with a community of people that are doing it at the same time. Some people think of it as a catalyst to, you know, socially enjoyable activities of whatever sort. But oftentimes in these scenarios, it's like we're not just talking about alcohol. I mean, thinking about the types of foods that you want to consume more of if you're consuming alcohol. Um, I mean, I don't know a lot of people that are yanking out like salads and stuff when they're going out drinking with their friends. So there's domino effects on this aside from just only the impact of alcohol on the body. There's more to it than that, which really doesn't come as a surprise to anybody that's listening, probably. But if you think about that for yourself and thinking about, all right, well, it's not just that. What else is there? Not only leading to it, but then subsequent to that, then we're not only talking about a specific, oh, these drinks that are consumed at these times. We're talking about actually a larger percentage of the week that has an impact on in some way, shape, or form.
You are right. Most people do not eat salads when they're engaging in drinks or not. So yeah, there is that social aspect, the social norms of it. But I think which is kind of interesting enough is there's like I guess we can call it a trend. There's been a really big trend of challenging those norms. So I've actually seen more availability of the more trend actually to lean toward more non-alcoholic based beverages, or the market that's really met up with that. It is okay to enjoy socially without engaging in the alcohol component. So I actually feel that that's a reflection of a trend of change of in time, that these options now are really readily available, which is pretty cool to see. And a lot more people are challenging those norms of, maybe I don't need to watch a game or need to have fun with beverages. So, as long as your biggest takeaway on this one is, taking the step back, looking at that, looking at consumption and seeing kind of what the next steps are for reduction, if that's what you want to go. As well as I guess my disclaimer would be, so if you are finding that you are consuming a lot of alcohol, high amounts of alcohol, and considering reduction, probably would also recommend just following up with your family doctor as well. We know that there are consequences of that, from going from heavy drinking to what you would call cold turkey or none. So that would be something that you would want to seek just even medical support for.
And relating to medical support with that, this is quite similar to what we were saying about stress and other mental health struggles, where the excess alcohol consumption doesn't need to feel like an alcohol use disorder or alcoholism. There can still be excessive alcohol if you find that it's interfering with your life in some way, or if it's something that you are overly thinking about excessively or relying on excessively, maybe as a form of stress relief or something that you are extremely looking forward to at the end of each week or the end of each day. Just really considering the degree, like what role it plays in your life, and maybe if there is a chance that it is getting to be more than where it should be, or if it is beyond some of those guidelines.
Awesome points. Um, Funny enough, a common outcome relate or a common thing that's impacted by alcohol consumption that I know a lot of people, when I say this, are probably going to be like, "Oh yeah, that's not surprising," is sleep. Um, So let's dive into sleep a little bit. And obviously, there's an impact of alcohol consumption on sleep, but let's bring it back to a little bit more general and just general things related to sleep and how sleep can impact this conversation around stress management and how these things impact people's lives. So usually, when I'm thinking of sleep, I mean, it's the chicken egg situation. Is the stressful situation causing you to not sleep as much because there's just a lot of stuff going on? Or is it the other way around? Chances are it's both. I don't think you can isolate one or the other, really, when you think about it. But I have yet to hear a person that I've talked to that started getting, they were having like 5 to 6 hours of sleep a day, and they just are in a situation where they can actually choose to quite easily sleep longer. They don't have necessarily a condition that impacts their sleep or makes it difficult to sleep or causes them to wake up a lot. You just go from 5 to 6 hours to 7 to 8 hours for like a couple of weeks, and they're like, wow, that has such an impact. And then I'm just like, yeah, really? I mean, that's awesome. It's not always that easy, though, mind you. But when it comes to sleep, impact of sleep, sleep hygiene, what are some things that you guys can think of?
Yeah, definitely it impacts sleep. So it does impact like the number frequently of wakings as well as lower quality sleep. So we do see that potentially even the wake cycle of from a hydration perspective alone, you might actually just be getting up to go to the bathroom more, which goes to that more wakings and less sleep for sure. The Sleep Foundation will even say like long-term alcohol use can develop into chronic sleep problems like sleep apnea, which we know that sleep apnea then also leads into wakings and not good quality sleep and tired and fatigueness too. So it kind of can mask a clinical disorder, sleep disorder as well. And also back to your point, Brandon, of for gauging in alcohol and drinking and having also some food on the side, we know that the digestion component on sleep is impacted then just from eating before bed as well. So yeah, I don't know if the chicken or the hen came first, but there is a lot of things that it can have an impact on.
It's a domino effect, man. Dominoes everywhere. Matthew, go ahead.
And some people may feel that, yeah, after drinking alcohol, they fall asleep just fine. But it is not just how long it takes to fall asleep, it's the quality of sleep there. You may have been in your bed for 7 or 8 hours afterwards, but it may have been not very deep sleep, or it may be disrupted, like Andrea said, whether it is getting up to urinate or it's even just waking up and having trouble falling back asleep. So that's an important thing to emphasize there in terms of the impact on sleep quality.
Even though not quite sleep, but also can be related to kind of the behavioral component is, so we know alcohol also has an impact on different types of medications that people take. So different kind of medications for sleep or mood or anything like that is, if you're trying to work on tools for one area, that alcohol impacting medications could also actually be causing a problem in other areas or not working as well, or the adherence component might not be there either, which can also impact sleep, right? If you're as well. So I think there's so many different things that it can impact on just a general health sense.
It's I mean, just think about it for a sec. I mean, we've all had a situation where we had a crappy sleep due to whatever reason, and obviously there's many things that can impact those pieces for anybody. But then you have less energy, which means that you may not tolerate things, stressful situations, or even seemingly not super stressful situations super well. Um, and then there's obviously some things that come from that. Because you're sleeping not as well, you don't have as much energy, then you may not have as much energy or motivation to do things like meal planning, preparation, cooking, shopping, etc. eating out increases in your fast food or restaurants, or you don't feel like moving as much because you're tired. Okay, then your step count and your exercise decreases, so on and so forth. So it's which can then perpetuate issues with sleep all over again. So it's a circle in a way of all of these things. And I mean, that's not even an exhaustive list of all the things that could come from it too. Um, yeah, sleep is an interesting thing that I think is sometimes it's not taken as seriously as it probably should be in some cases. Some people take it very seriously, some people don't. Um, but yeah, it's a huge impact, that's for sure. Related to one's ability to tolerate stressful situations. And so, I mean, this is commonly thought of like if you haven't slept enough, you're going to be grumpy. You're going to not be maybe as nice of a person as you would if you were sleeping well. Um, Add that to along of other things that we've discussed thus far that can impact how you experience the world on a day to day basis. But this ties into something that can be a thing for some people, which is emotional eating. And I know for men, this presents in different ways. And so, who had the stats on this one? I can't remember.
I added the numbers into there just regarding prevalence of emotional eating. One study we found suggests that about 13% of men have excessive food cravings, compared to about 28% of women. So, about an eighth of the male population and a bit over a quarter of the female population. So, these are common um, issues among people that also seem to present differently based on sex. So the cravings that come up for men in these situations tend to be foods that are more savory in nature. So things like meat. And then with women, it seems to be more often sweet foods. So it's interesting that goes a bit differently based on sex.
I mean, cue the other conversations that you and I had, Matthew, the last episode and the one before. Some of that kind of tracks with previous conversation that we had around types of things. I mean, if you're going to be craving something, and it could be a fluke though as to why those patterns are the way that they are, but it definitely has similarities with what we talked about previously in some way.
Protein choices from last time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Have you seen the banner, the cover image for the previous episodes on YouTube, Andrea?
I don't think so.
Or the
No.
blogs? Oh, you should. They're hilarious. Oh, you should check them out.
I'll have to
Everybody
go
else
check them
listening
out.
and watching should check them out too. Matthew put together some really funny. I laughed. I don't know. Maybe not everybody will laugh, but I laughed.
I will do that right after this because now I'm super intrigued.
Everybody's going to our YouTube page maybe now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, but this also leads into other things as well. So I mean, emotional eating and how people respond to cravings and in situations and stressful situations. But this kind of gets into another thing as well. Um, that's kind of a next door neighbor in some kind of a way, but in some ways not. Which is disordered eating, which is a little bit more intense than just like an emotional reaction that is impacted by food. Um, who put these ones down here? I can't remember.
Well, there's a few on there, and it's also important to remember, like when we're talking about these would be diagnosable based eating disorders. There's a few different categories within that, so we'll touch on like a few of them, but also know that some of these numbers aren't some can be related to men, and then some are kind of more of a just kind of a I don't want to say blanket statement, but encompasses all basically. And I'll let Matthew take some of the eating disorder ones. The one that shows up within the population that I work with, which is people living with obesity, is binge eating disorder. So that's eating a large amount in a sitting over time that leads to kind of emotional guilt, things like that. Can be up to as high as 36%. So that's very high. That's a pattern we see a lot, or people will confuse with, oh, I just, snack a lot, or, emotionally eat a lot. And it's important to remember that there's a little bit of a difference diagnosably wise when we talk about these terms. So do know that too, because emotional eating, cravings and stuff are a normal human response. But then these other pieces would be dysfunctions of that.
Yeah, the binge eating disorder statistic is 36%, up to 36% in of the population with obesity. And then if we look at some of the other uh, disordered eating, other conditions or behaviors, first, if we step back more broadly, the overall lifetime prevalence is estimated to be about 4% among males, even though it is thought of frequently to be less common than that. And that's because when a lot of people hear about eating disorders or disordered eating, their mind often goes to something like anorexia nervosa, which is seen in very low amounts in males in studies and in reporting. But we have to consider that, like Andrea said, there are other conditions like binge eating disorders, like night eating disorders. And once we put that all together, the prevalence appears to be somewhere around 8% for females, 4% for males. Although there are various numbers in different studies and in different populations based on the country. So things to consider with that are, like we said, the overall prevalence, but also how it can present differently in males and females. Males are more likely to have body image concerns where the goal or the concern is trying to maybe increase weight or increase muscularity, as we discussed in the previous episode, versus more restrictive type of behaviors. But when we even consider that, there is still high prevalence of this in young male and young female populations. For example, one study done in Ontario found that 30% of females and 25% of males between the ages of 10 and 14 reported dieting to lose weight. Dieting to lose weight is the primary goal. So these behaviors do show up at an early age, both in boys and in girls. And a similar study being done in similar studies being done in other areas in Canada. One study from Manitoba found 12% of boys and girls reported dieting in the past year to lose weight. So again, these types of goals and behaviors are starting younger and younger, and both in boys and girls. And of those children, 35% said they've done it for at least a few months or longer in the past year. So not just a short-term type of thing, but excessive restriction over long periods of time. And a lot of the kids shown in these studies describe the dieting as being strict, either somewhat or extremely strict. About a third of those children reported this. So it is becoming a greater concern that these things are popping up younger and younger. And as we discussed in the last episode, there do seem to be some social media components that are contributing to some of these things.
Yeah. And I think, Matthew, I'd have to look at some of their research because the numbers do feel really low, but that's because they're, the clinically based diagnosis. But then when you look at the flip side of some of the research, which, people living with diabetes or people living with obesity, is the prevalence of mental health, especially is a very high amount. And we know that the impact of anxiety, depression, ADHD, trauma, things like that, do have an impact then on eating patterns, eating styles, but potentially not the enough to be the diagnosis, but we would see it show up, or even lack of eating, which is one of the things that we sometimes see with depression or severe depression, right? All of a sudden lack of appetite, not eating. So it's interesting that the numbers are low from those pieces, but then we see the eating, the problematic eating, which is a word that I use a lot with my clients, shows up in other areas as a result of other things.
Yeah, and I think the big point for me here is that uh, things earlier in life. I mean, we're talking about some of these stats looking at, as young as 10, 14, around there. I mean, a lot of people that I've talked to that have challenges with these types of things later in life, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, sometimes even 60s. There's these things that happened earlier in life or that people were exposed to or whatever else, and before anybody listening or watching just says it's because of social media, think of news, think of magazines, think of tabloids by the grocery store cashier, like all those things that are in we're exposed to, parents, friends, other family members. All of these things can just make their way into your brain and have an impact on how you handle things 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road. So it's worth considering these pieces, which is why I brought them up to begin with. But another point that I thought of, that I've found particularly interesting, and I may see this a little bit more in my areas as I work with more active people, athletes, sports, things like this, or even just people that are working out a lot. There is sometimes a case where we use like restriction or like being hyper focused on specific things with nutrition, but we kind of use, oh, I'm trying to build muscle, or oh, I'm trying to get better at, you know I'm trying to bring my marathon time down, so I'm trying to bring my body fat level down, or whatever else. We use these as a mask or as a kind of a justification for these types of behaviors that may or may not actually be beneficial in some way to performance or health in a general sense. So it can sometimes work like that too, where it's like you think whether you know it or not. And it's actually a positive thing when, well, you peel the layers back, and it might not be as performance or health promoting as one might think.
Yep. And I think that we could probably actually get a whole other episode on that. Is our thoughts drive a lot of this. If we've got a thought of perfectionism or all or nothing thinking, or we're all in to, bulk up and going to get to there, things like that, that can drive a lot of those potentially harmful um, thoughts. And so it is important to kind of stop and think about, is what I'm saying to myself something that's coming from a good place, from, or is it coming from something else, a different type of coping mechanism? And that's, we do know that there is a lot of really strong research on early exposure, trauma, things like that, that can lead to these decisions and show up in something as simple as, oh, I just need to bulk up to meet this need. We might not put that together, which is why when we talked about in the beginning of this, of something small can be a total great opportunity to have a conversation and go, you know what, this is something I might need to look into. This is something I might need to talk to somebody about. Could be something really simple, or it could be something that's from uprooted.
And just to wrap things up here, we can just summarize what the main things that we can take away from this are when it comes to managing either the more directly nutrition related side of things when it comes to mental well-being, or things that can be more of a general emotional wellness type of tips. So where we can start on the nutrition side of things is just trying to move towards eating regularly with meals and snacks. So the meals don't all need to look perfect, but starting with just a regular eating pattern to try to regulate hunger throughout the day and making sure that we're getting enough. If our hunger is a little lower, then maybe breaking that down more into larger snacks as opposed to larger meals, just so that it is doable. Making sure that in addition to those regular meals, we are consuming a good amount of protein, fiber, and general hydration. So again, protein being more of about a quarter or so of the meal. When it comes to thinking about reflecting on feelings, something like journaling can be helpful there, just to build awareness of how we're feeling, what's going on, and just building our overall mindfulness. Another thing to add on to that is just reflecting either throughout the day or throughout the week in terms of how we're feeling, whether that is emotions, whether that is hunger, and or whether that is things like cravings. Next is engaging in some form of self-care so that we are able to reduce stress and trying to address, again, these problems early on by ourselves the best that we can, and maybe reaching out to friends and family for support. And then after that, we would want to ensure that we are being realistic about goals and behavior changes and being kind to ourselves. So recognizing that things like cravings are normal, things like troubles with stress and that impacting other areas of life are normal, and just being realistic in what we are able to do both independently or with support from friends and family. And then lastly, recognizing when it is time to seek help from either a professional or others around us with some of these things, whether that is the nutrition, reaching out to a dietitian, or reaching out to a family doctor or mental health professional when it comes to managing some of the issues we discussed today.
A great way to leave it, I think. Um, so yeah, there is maybe our final episode for this little mini series. I'm sure, yeah, we have a lot of areas that we can dig into more that we discussed today, but I hope that if that final list of things that Matthew rattled off there that give you some actionable areas that you can focus on. But nonetheless, really hope that you found some part of this talk or the conversation helpful. If it was one little nugget, then I'm a happy guy. But thanks for taking the time for watching, listening, and thanks to you guys, Matthew and Andrea, for spending another afternoon chatting about life and, in this case, men's health. Look forward to our next one.